Now we'll go to the executive budget. Commissioner Dardenne. And members, I think it will be projected on your TV screens as well. We've made arrangements to have the presentation on your screens.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. Good afternoon. I just will reiterate what the chair just said, and for those watching who are not in the chamber, the presentation I'm about to make is you can find online at doa.la.gov. It is posted there as well as being distributed to the members. I think you've got paper copies as well. This process began in November. I want to start by recognizing that and let you know what goes on in this process. It literally represents a quarter of the year. The busiest holiday quarter of the year, November, December, January, is when our staff is working, putting together this budget and meeting with the various departments of state government. The leaders of the divisions and the budget staff are here today to help if there are any questions. Barbara Goodson, Travis McElwain, Ternisa Hutchison, and the various managers are seated on the side over there as well. I want to take us back to the good old days to start. I'm going to describe our process a little bit chronologically, and you see the first slide you see was January 13th, 2020, a day that I know we all remember, and that the euphoria of that day continued in the early part of the calendar year 2020, as I think all of you know. When this committee met February 7th, 25 days after that national championship celebration. We presented a proposed budget to you that reflected the excitement and the optimism that I think was felt at that time. We were seeing a tremendous uptick in the economy. There was an improvement in our budget forecast. For the first time, I could stand before you and not be talking about dramatic cuts, talking more about some things we wanted to do to invest in things that we felt were appropriate. And if you, the next slide shows you that general fund direct number at that time was over $10 billion, a number we had not seen in quite a while. That's what we were hoping to see when that budget was presented. But lo and behold, 34 days later, March 11th of 2020, the governor issued an executive order that has obviously been in effect since that date. And we had the same reaction that Macaulay Culkin had in the movie Home Alone. We all wondered, oh my gosh, what in the world has happened? And at that point began probably the strangest year in all of our lifetimes. 386 days since that executive declaration until today. And I doubt that any of us at that time would have expected the tragedy that was going to befall us was going to be continuing when we met again this year talking about the state budget, but lo and behold, it does. And 2 months later, the reality set in. And if you look at that next slide, you see the revised REC forecast for the then current budget year was reduced by almost $1 billion, $904 million reduction in the state general fund. That obviously had us all very concerned, but it was the appropriate thing to do given the fact that the economy was frozen and we really weren't sure exactly how long this was going to last. And our economists had never faced a situation like this. Nobody in the country had faced a situation like this. And so we wondered, when's it all going to end? And we don't know when it's all going to end just yet, but we know this. We're moving in the right direction right now. At least at this budget meeting, we can say that the country, the state is moving in the right direction in terms of reining in the pandemic. Despite that, if you look at the next slide, the revised revenue forecast for the 21-22 year, which is what we refer to as FY 22, is $9.5 billion in state general funds. On its face, that is going to suggest, obviously, that we need to be making reductions in the budget because of that reduction in the amount of state general fund that is now part of the forecast. That is not necessarily the case, as you will see as I go through this presentation and explain to you what has been done to address this issue, what has been done to present you a budget that does not require the level of cuts that the state has had to endure over the course of a number of years. In fact, we don't recommend cuts in this budget based upon our ability to maximize the use of other dollars than the state general fund to be able to do the kind of things that we've all talked about wanting to do as we move our state forward. The next slide just shows you in graph form the difference in the dates, the forecast in those dates. That January 31 date was the date of the REC meeting that led to that last year forecast, and it shows you how we've dipped based upon where we are right now. So it was a very difficult year. It was a very tough year, obviously. We have endured a record number of 7 named storms in this state. We were one of the first states to be severely impacted by COVID, over 40,000 cases, 9,000 Louisianians having lost their lives. Recently impacted by an unprecedented ice storm that has now created a new emergency for us, not arising out of wind and water, but arising out of cold temperatures. And then we endured Tom Brady and what he did to the New Orleans Saints. What's next? Locusts? I don't think so. I think we're going to avoid the locusts, and I think there is reason for some degree of optimism right now, which is why I want to explain to you what our thinking is as we present this budget to you. You'll see on the next slide, I like this little boy's posturing. We're tough, we're resilient, we're optimistic, and with good reason. We've had a number of success stories that we can point to that have moved the state in the right direction. There is absolutely no way to sugarcoat the sadness, the loneliness, the tragedy, the frustration of the past 12 months. But there are reasons to be optimistic as we sit today and begin the process. And obviously, this is the first step in beginning the process of crafting a budget for the people of this state for the future fiscal year. Some of these reasons for optimism I have on the next few charts and some of the next slides that you'll see. I'm not going to go through all the detail that's contained in the slides. That's why we made them fairly detailed, so you can take this with you, use it as a resource point for where we are and what has been accomplished with our working together, with the governor and the legislature working together, setting priorities and making things happen. Our GDP, as you can see, had been recovering for 3 years, 17, 18, 19. We're doing well. We're moving in the right direction. The pandemic hit, and obviously it bottoms out. But what we're seeing now is that in the third quarter of the current year, we're recovering significantly, increase of 9% in our GDP. That is projected, at least according to Moody's, that is projected to continue going upward in the fourth quarter. Not as aggressively as that 9%, but at least the projection right now has us continuing to be on the climb. And that's obviously a very good thing, as you see, as we kind of inch back up to where we were in previous years. Louisiana's personal income, obviously, the situation with the pandemic created a problem from an economic standpoint with people's incomes, but it was offset based upon what Congress did. And so that provides some little jolt that is going to affect where we ultimately go with personal income. The first 2 quarters of the impact of the pandemic, the personal income grew because of those federal dollars. But obviously, when those dollars ran out, this has continued for much longer than that. You can see a decline there in personal income. It's one of the things that REC is very cognizant of and watching very carefully, and will be very interested when income tax returns are filed here, obviously this year. And when we start getting some filings, although most people who owe money don't pay early, they wait until the deadline to pay their state income tax. But we'll certainly get some definitive answers when we ultimately get tax returns filed for the previous year. The next slide just shows you non-farm and private employment. It looks pretty much exactly the same. You can see where the big dip was and how we're slowly moving in the right direction with employment. Unemployment, and Ava was just mentioning, it started to recover, but we're still about 90,000 jobs away from where we were February a year ago. So we've got some work to do, and we're not where we want to be or where we need to be in terms of our restoration of job opportunities for the people of this state. And the unemployment rate chart shows that as well. The huge spike you can see at the outset of the pandemic, it's starting to come down. We're moving in the right direction. This is a chart that you want to see going down, going in the wrong direction, or going in the direction that shows more people are working so that our unemployment rate is lower. And that's what we're doing. It's trending appropriately, but we're not back to where we need to be and where we want to be. One of the best pieces of good news that we've gotten very recently is on the next slide. And I want to talk about this for just a second to put this in perspective. The rating agencies have frowned upon Louisiana over the course of the past decade or so. It's been very frustrating for us as we've tried to stabilize the budget to communicate to the rating agencies what we've done and to make our appeal to improve our bond rating, because as our bond rating improves, we get better interest rates when we go into the market, and that obviously saves us money. On February 12th of this year, Moody's advised us that we were changing Louisiana's outlook from stable to positive. Stable just means what it says, but positive means good things are happening. And that's a very encouraging sign that we're getting from Moody's. And I highlighted or boldfaced some particular phraseology that I think we ought to focus on. It's a positive outlook reflecting aligning revenue and spending, careful fiscal management. And there's some things that we have to look to as we try and get this bond rating increased. This is just an outlook. It doesn't change our bond rating. It doesn't increase our bond rating. But the obvious next step from a positive outlook is to say it's time to now upgrade our bond status. And I can assure you we will be aggressively making that pitch to Moody's and other rating agencies as we meet with them, and we'll be talking to them next week. They're very interested in what goes on. And by the way, it's maybe surprising to some of you how carefully Wall Street analysts look at state budgets and look at meetings like this and listen to what's said and what's reported in the press as they evaluate states and see what the mindset is of policymakers, what the economy looks like in the state. And we're going to be, I'll be making the same type of presentation to them that I'm making to you today. One of the things they've recognized is our aligning revenue and spending and the stability that we've created in our budget. And that's something we've talked about for a long time, that we needed to have a stable budget. We needed to reduce our raids on funds to use as one-time expenditures. We need to be consistent in what we do. And as you debate during the course of the session that'll begin in the not too distant future, obviously it's a fiscal session. It's a tax session. It's an opportunity to talk about what we do with our tax structure in Louisiana. And I mention this because obviously the rating agencies pay close attention to this. And as you go undertake these debates, and we've followed closely and are working closely with the senator and representative chairing the tax committees, and there's a lot of talk about proposals that are going to be made, and a lot of that are things that you've considered before, and that the task force on structural change in budget and tax policy recommended a number of these changes, and I think it's great that you're going to be discussing those. And the governor has indicated the administration is going to be supportive of anything that we can do to improve the structure of our system so long as it's revenue neutral. And I would just say we have to be very careful that we don't fall into the trap of saying we've got all this federal money now, and so gosh, we ought to be reducing taxes and we don't need the money, and we've got the cliff facing us with that sales tax that's rolling off the books. And I would just urge caution that we don't fall into the same trap that we've fallen into before, because this is going to be something that absolutely is going to be looked at by rating agencies and as we make decisions on what we do. Just to put it in perspective, Louisiana's bond rating went up for the first time in almost, I don't see where my note is, for decades after the Stelly plan initially passed. In very short order after that plan passed, just for information purposes, our bond rating increased with all the rating agencies. When the effect of the repeal was realized, it immediately went down. And I only say that to you because you're going to make the decisions, obviously, but to be cognizant that the decisions we make right now, when all of a sudden we've got this federal money flowing into us, are very important decisions that we have to look at beyond just this year. And all of us will be concerned about what happens when that federal money goes away. And it's something I'll be talking about as I proceed with the presentation. And this is a very surprising bit of information, I think, if you look at the next slide. In 2020, look at the number of project wins that the Department of Economic Development points to. It's more than any year prior to that other than 19. And retaining jobs and creating new jobs in the midst of the pandemic. And there have been a lot of exciting projects. This is a list here. I won't go through all of them that have been announced that are going to be very meaningful for the state in many of your districts of the members represented today, as well as all over the state. And we got great news, for example, from Amazon with a project in Carencro, and we're hopeful that Baton Rouge will get some good news later this year in that regard. We're watching that very closely. The accomplishments of DOTD, I'm not going to go through in detail just in the interest of time, but I wanted to provide this to you to see the number of projects that Dr. Wilson's department has been moving forward, that you've been funding, that we've been able to do because of a variety of funding sources. One of the most important ones I've highlighted for you here, and that's the Mississippi River Deepening Project, an expensive project led by the Corps of Engineers with a significant local match that has a tremendously profound positive influence on the state to the extent that we can deepen that channel and get larger boats coming in deeper, further into Louisiana to unload their wares. That's going to create some tremendous opportunities. Senator Abraham just reminded me about a project for Calcasieu that the state has committed to as well, that we're going to be taking a close look at, that is not listed in this proposed budget, but it's something that I know that we have talked about, and we've recognized the same thing in the Calcasieu River Chip Channel to be able to get folks there in that area that is in need of as much help as they can get, given the problems that have befallen that area over the course of the past year. You have information on the Garvey bonds that Secretary Wilson talked about moments ago, the I-20 exchange at Barksdale, the Loyola Drive improvement in Kenner, the I-10 corridor here in Baton Rouge that's going to be underway, and the Belle Chase Bridge, all funded with federal Garvey bond dollars. Reminder of the bond refinancing projects that have been underway during this time. Whenever we refinance bonds, we do that so that we can save money, so that we can so there can be a longer or a better savings realized for the state in paying off that bonded indebtedness. Likewise, in 2020, a summary of the achievements of CPRA and what we're doing to rebuild America's wetland, Louisiana's coast, and the dollars that are being spent, the money that's being invested to try and make that place safer and to do what we can do to try and rebuild land. We've lost as a state since the 1930s or 40s or so enough land to match the size of the state of Delaware. I mean, that's a staggering thought, but that's exactly what's happened with Louisiana's coastline eroding. And so everything that you do and that we're able to do as a state to make certain we're rebuilding the coast, we're making it more storm resistant, and we're doing things to build land is a very important step, not only for the people who live there, but for all of us in the state and all of us in the country who ought to recognize the importance of the port system throughout South Louisiana, the ability to process and transport natural gas and oil, which is a big part of our economy, and I think is going to stay that way for some period of time, and tourism and seafood that everyone enjoys. All that is threatened if we don't save the coastline. Some of the things that happened during the healthcare surge had a positive note, and it's hard to talk about anything positive that's come from this, but what we should realize is that 7,500 young people, primarily young people, graduated or finished early in the healthcare field in the midst of the pandemic, enable them to go into work in this very field that has been challenged and has been so generous in giving their time and energy and risking their safety for Louisianians during the pandemic. And you see the number of degrees and certificates that have been given during that time frame. 2,000 LCTCS graduates connected with the Louisiana Nursing Home Association for employment during that time period. LSU Shreveport created testing swabs, produced testing swabs. LSU in Baton Rouge, medical gowns produced at the PMAC, not on the not basketball being played, but literally medical gowns being processed. And face shield produced by Nunez Community College using 3D printers and laser cutters. I mean, innovative steps that Louisiana took to react to the crisis. LumCon is often overlooked by a lot of folks who don't live on the Louisiana coastline, but it's a very viable part of the economy of the state, and a lot of things are happening there in that LUMCON Blue Works program that's described on the slide. I also want to mention to you, in Houma, 3 National Science Foundation vessels are being built in Houma, Louisiana. They'll wind up in Oregon, in Rhode Island, and right here in Louisiana. The community college is training people to work on and repair vessels, a big part of the economy in South Louisiana that is not going to go away, and we need to be training people to take advantage of those opportunities. K-12 education, students all across the state have benefited from in-person instruction, and not only have the school systems reopened, but about 65% are now benefiting from in-person instruction. It's amazing to think about the transformation that took place in the educational arena, both at the K-12 level and at the higher education level a year ago. If the legislature had said, or the governor had said to the education establishment, that in a matter of a week or 2 weeks or a month, you've got to start teaching entirely online. You've got to change your whole methodology of making things work. Everybody would have said it's impossible, it can't be done, there's no way, you got to study this, you got to figure it out. Well, we figured it out on the run. And our educational partners in Louisiana all need to be commended for the work that was done. It cost a lot of money. You're going to hear from them about how they need to be reimbursed for what was done during the past year instead of using some of the federal money that is coming our way in future expenditures. But that's going to be a big topic we'll all be watching very, very closely. But higher education, K-12 education, did a phenomenal job of having to modify what they do in order to make sure that people maintained a level of instruction in the pandemic that was not going to put us years and years behind. Different subject, but a chart that is about as telling as any as you can see is the prison population chart. And it shows you where we were from a peak as the most incarcerating state in America, and some would say in the world, the steady decline that has taken place since there was discussion underway about criminal justice reform. And those numbers continue to decline. Unfortunately, the cost of running prisons, the cost of operating a correction system is a lot. And it's very difficult to maintain employment in this sector, as you'll hear from the department and from me briefly in just a few minutes. But that's a very interesting statistic when you look at where we were in terms of incarcerating people. So now the money. FY20 surplus, you know about this, $270 million from the 20 fiscal year. That's the money that the Constitution tells us how you can spend it. You're going to make a deposit into the Budget Stabilization Fund. 25% of that money, 10% will pay down our unfunded accrued liability, and then the other uses are obviously one-time uses, generally of a capital nature. Our recommendation, as it was previously, will be the same in this year's budget cycle, and that is to divide the remainder of the money among DOTD projects, coastal projects, and capital outlay projects. Specifically in capital outlay, major repairs, demolitions, things that can be done with cash on the spot that ought not be the subject of 20 or 30-year bonded indebtedness. And so we'll be asking you again to consider those options for the use of that surplus money from FY20. And you'll see on the next slide the Budget Stabilization Fund, and this is a credit to what the legislature has done with that fund. You can see the high water mark right in the middle of the bar chart where we were with our fund balance in the rainy day fund. And you can see how it dwindled and how it got particularly low in times where we had to tap into that fund. But look where it has gone the past year and look where it's going to go this year. It's going to be higher this year than for those of you who were present in the last 4 years during Governor Edwards' first term. It's higher than it was when we started that. And there's going to be infusion into the rainy day fund, appropriate infusion to make certain that it's getting it to where we want it to be. Likewise, on the next slide, just showing you the lasers and teachers retirement UAL situation. obviously there was a peak in payments that were made, and you can see that it is going down, and so those payments are going down and will eventually flatten out. We're on an appropriate road to take care of our unfunded accrued liability problem. It's not something we're proud of, having an unfunded accrued liability, but we're not alone. Many states across the country have similar problems. We're on a very good trajectory, though, to make certain that we satisfy that obligation in accordance with the law by the deadline of, I think, that's mighty small print, I think it's 2049. The supplemental, is that right? 29, I'm sorry, 2029, so much sooner than I mentioned. So we're going to get that done. Now, every year you face a supplemental bill during the legislative process where we recognize, if it's there, an excess in the current year's budget. At the recent REC meeting, the revenue forecast for the current year went up by $292 million. So it is anticipated that in the legislative session, you'll see a supplemental bill that will recommend expending that amount of money that is available to us in the current year that the forecast originally did not think would be there. We'll be looking to cover expenses related to the hurricane because we've gotten a 90-10 match on most all of the things we're facing on Laura and others. We're still going to have some obligations we're going to have to pay, and certainly some with COVID-19. Corrections and local housing, as always, will need some money. Wildlife and fisheries is going to need some money, which I'll discuss momentarily. And public safety and judgments will suggest paying with this money that we had not anticipated being there, but has materialized during the current year. So despite the challenges of the year and the pandemic, we are on track with our budget, and we're on track to have an excess, largely because we had lowered the forecast so low. I mean, obviously, not knowing what the situation was going to be a year ago at that meeting, right after the declaration came, the conference properly decided to reduce the forecast dramatically. And as you know, I was directed to come to you every month with the deficit avoidance plan in anticipation of what if things get even worse and we have to make mid-year cuts. Fortunately, and as I told you midway during the year, I didn't think that was going to be necessary, and it's not going to be necessary. But because that forecast was so low and we've done better than expected, we've got some excess this year. We haven't gotten to the level that we would have gotten to but for the pandemic, but we have to deal with the reality, and the reality is we started low and we've done better. So now let's turn to the 22 budget that's before you in the executive budget. And of course, this is the starting point. This is what we recommend to you. We recognize there'll be changes, there'll be modifications, ups and downs, and we'll debate and discuss what the priorities ought to be. And you ultimately will make the decision on what this budget looks like. This is giving you a roadmap of what we think it ought to look like. So here's the budget comparison for 22. The general fund number, actually, as you'll see as we get into this, is $406 million. It differs than the number you see on this slide because the rainy day fund contribution is backed out, and all carry forward numbers from a previous year are non-recurred. REC is going to meet again probably maybe in April, certainly in May. It'll meet before Appropriations gets the bill out of committee, I'm sure, and it may very well be that we'll meet in April. The Speaker is the chair of the conference now, so he'll call the next meeting. But at that next meeting, we'll know a little more than we knew at the last meeting. We'll have another couple of months of information about how we're doing. Is the economy recovering? Are numbers increasing? We have a hope and an expectation that things are going to get better and things are going to continue to show better, but we can't budget based on that. We have to budget based on where we are on the REC right now, and if more money is recognized, you'll have more money to decide what to do with if the forecast is improved. And the REC, at the conference last time, we did adopt the lower forecast, the more conservative forecast. There was a considerable difference between the two economists' recommendation. The conference chose the conservative one to be absolutely on the safe side, and that makes some sense, obviously, and we'll see if things are better, and we hope that they are. The next slide shows you the general fund budget, and really it's fairly consistent over the years. When you look at our budget and you talk about the fact that the budget keeps going up and up, it's really the federal dollars that drive most of the growth in the budget when you look at this general fund number that has been fairly consistent all the way back to FY10. I mean, those are not small numbers that are reflected in those differences, but generally speaking, it's a fairly consistent picture. And you can see it's obviously a little bit better than what we saw last year. The pie chart version of the general fund just shows you what you already know, and that is that education uses the largest chunk of dedicated money. The MFP is constitutionally dedicated. That's the huge amount that makes up that 38%. LDH, 23%, but as you also know, most every dollar we spend on LDH is matched with federal money that gives us a 3-to-1 type of a match, or depending on what year it is and what the match rate is, it gives us a significant amount of additional federal dollars. And higher ed, 12%. Those are the three big components, obviously, of the budget, and you see the other areas that are listed there that to give you an idea on exactly how that state general fund is spent. So how did we build the budget? What did we do? Well, the starting point was, what do we not have this year that we had last year? And those numbers are fairly readily discernible, and they're here for you on the next slide. $522 million from the Coronavirus Relief Fund. You know, last year we used a portion of that CARES money in the previous year's budget, and we used a portion of that money in this year's budget. That's the $522 million. $90 million came from the Rainy Day Fund. We don't have that to rely on again as we build the budget. And we used $300+ million in means of financing swaps that enabled us to use other sources of money than the state general fund to take care of certain expenditures. That was done last year. It's been done for years. The numbers are a little more dramatic this year than they've ever been, but that is not an unheard of or an inappropriate process. It's what we always do in trying to maximize the use of our general fund, because there are limits on what we can do, as you see with these constitutional and statutory dedications. So when we sat down to start thinking about this budget, we're looking at $921 million that's not available to us. So our first step was to figure out, all right, what funds can be available to us to build the budget? And this is a pivotal slide that explains to you what the logic is behind how we built the 22 budget. The REC told us that we have a $407 million growth in the general fund. That's what I was just talking about, the increase that REC recognized from the previous forecast to where it is right now. The lottery proceeds means of financing swap that was utilized in the previous budget year is also available to us during this year. $366 million in MOF fund swaps. That is the money that has been used already on the FMAP. Right. Okay. This component, this 366, is the money that we didn't budget because it was the January to June time frame where the federal government continued the emergency FMAP rate. And this is the thing that has come in and saved the day for the budget when you get right down to it, is that the federal government has said during this pandemic, we're going to pay the states more than we were previously paying, to the tune of 6.2%. That lowers the amount that Louisiana is responsible for Medicaid treatment, increases the amount that the federal government will pay. That was put into effect January to June. Now, and what we learned as we got into the process, we didn't know it when this started, but what we found out as the budget process was unfolding, the federal government has now indicated that that emergency FMAP rate is going to be continued from July to December of this year. It's going to take us through the end of the calendar year, which gets us through the first half of this 22 fiscal year. So that was money that originally we didn't know we were going to have, but we found out we were going to have, that is now factored in. And the federal government sent letters to every governor saying, this is what we're going to do. The new HHS secretary, I don't think has been confirmed yet, but this is what the federal government advised states: as you're planning your budget, we're going to extend this 6.2% increase through the end of the year. And that creates, as you can see, over $1 billion that is available to us as we figure out what the priorities of spending are. So the second step on the next slide was, all right, what are we going to do with this money? And as we stood here last year, we recommended a number of increases that we wanted to do and thought we would do before the pandemic, primarily centered around higher education. This year, we're making similar recommendations to you in a number of additional areas. And I'll go through each of these, but you can see the $206 million, almost $207 million in recommended increased spendings that we're saying to you ought to be a part of this budget to do the kind of things that we want to do to move people out of poverty, to create educational opportunities, to continue the kind of things we're doing to modernize government, and to make wise and sensible investments. So going through each of these, GOSEP, you're all familiar with the Louisiana Wireless Information Net, ELWIN as it's commonly called. It was a post-Katrina reaction to the fact that we were not able to talk to each other during an emergency. Local governments couldn't talk among themselves. They couldn't talk to us. It was a complete breakdown of communications and a recognition that we needed to have a statewide system that would let everybody be under the same umbrella. That's what ELWIN is. It's a statewide communication system for first responders and locals to be able to communicate. This is an investment in this system that is going to transfer it from public safety and state police to GOSEP and be able to use new technology that is going to further enhance that ELWIN system. Next is the investment in debt service. There is $14.3 million in non-appropriated debt for the 2021 general bond sale and for the first interest payment on the Corps of Engineers bond issue that we're recommending to you. And I'm going to explain this in just a few minutes because it's very important, and it's a very important investment that we need to make. In December of 21, the United States Congress authorized a forgiveness of the construction interest charged to Louisiana for the building of the Hurricane Storm Damage and Risk Reduction System, HIDRIS, another one of these acronyms. In that congressional allocation, it directed the state to make a principal payment of $400 million by September of this year, and that remaining principal would be paid by September 30th of 2023. The proposal that we are making, and it's on the next slide in some detail, is that we bond this indebtedness. Given the low interest rates that exist right now, given the magnitude of the debt that unfortunately we owe to the federal government, it makes complete sense to bond this indebtedness and pay the federal government off in one fell swoop. Sell the bonds, use the proceeds to pay the federal government, and pay for that over a period of time at an extremely low interest rate. The difference in savings to the state is staggering. The amount that is owed on the principal of the debt is $1.2 billion. $1.2 billion. By utilizing this plan and paying this off over a maximum of 4 years, we're going to save a tremendous amount of money, as you see on this slide. If we can pay it off in 3 years, we will save even more. That remains to be seen if we'll have the financial wherewithal to be able to do that. But in any event, if we are able to, when we pay it off within 4 years, you can see the savings that we're going to realize with a bond sale as opposed to what we would otherwise have to pay. The principal number is not the operative number that would have otherwise been owed, because when they waived the pre-construction interest, that knocked a huge chunk off of it. But there is still interest that is owed on the period of time for 30 years worth of interest, and it's a staggering amount. And so we literally can save over $1 billion by this bond program that we're recommending to you, and that we'll be taking before the Bond Commission as a way to get rid of this debt. And the only way that this is happening is because Congress, our delegation, convinced the United States Congress to put this in legislation, to waive that interest, to set up a mechanism that mandated payment first payment by September of 2021. That is the way that the Congressional Budget Office was able to score that amendment in a way that did not jeopardize the federal debt. And that's a very important factor, because if that could not have been done, we probably would not have been successful in getting this congressional action. But our delegation has paved the way for us to save this money, and it'll be up to us to enact the legislation and sell the bonds to realize that savings. So I hope and pray that that will be done, because it represents a significant savings to the people of this state. There are statewide adjustments on the next slide that are built into the budget. They include the civil service market rate adjustment, an increased premium at group benefits that we have talked about for some period of time that will take effect January 1st, risk management premium increases. And we're going to have to steel ourselves for what that risk management premium increase is going to look like down the road in the wake of the ice storms and the 7 hurricanes that we had to endure this year, because all that factors into the evaluation that's going to be made about our risk management component. Next, the education. I know you saw the governor's announcement yesterday. The minimum foundation program is fully funded by maximizing the use of dedicated funds. That's that lottery proceeds swap that we've talked about before. The student count in FY21 has been lower than expected, obviously, because a lot of kids did not enroll in the midst of the pandemic. That number is going to go up, and the superintendent is working very hard to get that number up. We think it is still going to be lower than otherwise would be expected, despite the efforts that are going to be underway by DOE to get kids back in school this fall. And included in the MFP proposal will be a $40 million pay raise for teacher and support workers, $400 for certified teachers, $200 for support workers, be a part of the MFP, probably in level 3, I think is the way it's typically done. And that you'll see that when the formula comes. And obviously we're hopeful that we'll be able to provide that pay raise for teachers. It's modest relative to the last increase that was given, but it gets us closer and closer to where we want to be in terms of fighting with the Southern average. The Department of Education, and I'm sure you've read this as well, the Department of Education received about over $1 billion in December from the federal government, over $1 billion, with a directive that I think 80% of that go to local school entities. So they're going to have to pass through 80% of that $1 billion plus to our local school districts all across the state. But they have available to them as the department $100 million, over $100 million, about $106 or so $million. You're going to ask, just like we asked, what are you going to do with that money? And we haven't gotten those answers yet from the department. They're obviously working on what to do. They found out about this in December, and they're making their decisions on what they're going to recommend. We hope, I hope, and I'm sure many of you will hope, that a significant amount of that goes to early childhood education. We have not provided in the proposed budget a state general fund increase to early childhood education. And the specific reason why is because we know all this money rests with the Department of Education. I don't know what the limitations are yet. They may not know all the limitations yet, but I feel pretty confident that one of the uses that will be available for that money is going to be to do things like enhance early childhood education. So we're going to be looking to some of that money to help with that process, with that need, and obviously to the extent that the legislature wants to provide additional funds for early childhood education, that is going to be part of the discussion that you undertake. We did not propose that in the budget, basically because we want to know how this $1 billion that's available and has to be spent is going to be used. The general fund investment in higher education is very significant. And again, similar questions are going to be asked of higher ed with the money that they got. Higher education institutions in the state got $260 million from the federal government in the December act that was passed. 78 million of that has to be passed on directly to students, which is what the CARES Act provision that went to higher ed required. They had to pass on a certain amount to students. I think it was half last time. It's $78 million this time. But that leaves a significant amount of money available to the institutions of higher education that they have at their disposal. In our discussions with them, and you will hear from them obviously in great detail, they've explained that most of that money needs to be used to reimburse them for expenditures that they made in the previous fiscal year to make the things happen that happen to continue providing education in a remote level and to react to the expenditures that they had to incur to make their campuses safe, to provide for the students and what have you. That is also going to be a topic of discussion you'll be interested in, is what's going to be done with that money as it relates to what we're recommending be done with state general fund dollars. Our recommendation to you is that we allocate $15.6 million for the mandated costs that higher education has to bear as a result of things that we as a state, you as a legislature, the services we provide at the state level have to pay for. And as you've heard before, at least one institution pays back more than they get. I mean, it's an inequity and it's an unfortunate situation. We want to try and take some steps to address that by allocating over $15 million for mandated costs. We've included $19.8 million for faculty pay increases as well, to be determined by Board of Regents and the various systems on how that's going to be handled. Formula increases, which is the direct allocation per campus, per system, per campus. We're recommending a $15.5 million increase. These are similar to the recommendations we made when the budget was presented last year that had to be abandoned as a result of the problems from the pandemic. The specialty units that you hear a lot from, Southern Ag, LSU Ag, the medical schools, or the health science centers, and Pennington, we've allocated an additional $5.5 million, kind of consistent with what we've given to them previously, because as you know, they don't have students, and so they don't get tuition dollars, and so they're left out of the formula calculation. I will just add as an aside that we're particularly excited about what's taking place at Pennington here in Baton Rouge with literally the world-renowned expert on obesity and surgery related to obesity and diabetes, and a tremendous partnership that's been established with the Lake here in Baton Rouge that is going to hopefully morph into making Baton Rouge a medical destination for those people across the country, across the world, who are looking to have the best and the brightest operate on them. And that's what long-term goal is for that particular program. I have some information. I don't think I have it in your slides, but just as we're trying to address the average salary and where our higher education institutions are, Louisiana ranks 47th in terms of average salaries for higher ed officials, not officials, instructors, faculty members at four-year institutions. We're 48th, one rung lower when it comes to two-year institutions. And likewise, on the Southern REB average, we're well behind as well. The next two slides just paint the picture of the higher education story over the course of the past decade. I'm sorry. I forgot to mention, it's on your slides. I apologize. Thanks for reminding me. We have increased GO grants from $1 million to $11 million, which is the same amount of increase in the TOPS program. So this is a recognition of what the state is trying to do to provide opportunities for those people who are dependent upon those GO grants to get an educational opportunity. So that's a significant increase, obviously, that was not in the previous budget. The two bar slides show you the slide in higher education funding from that peak year and how we're inching very slowly back up in funding. I know that over the course of as long as I can remember, everybody who's run for the legislature, serves in the legislature, runs for statewide office, serves in statewide office, has talked about the importance of education and that it is the key to stopping our poverty rates in Louisiana, from reversing the trend of poverty from cycle to cycle to cycle. It's the key to educating our workforce to be prepared for the jobs of the new millennium. And we've recognized that we're low on the totem pole, as I just indicated to you, on virtually every standard by which we measure K-12 education and higher education. When we have an opportunity to do something about it, we need to do that, is the governor's view, and that's what is proposed in this particular item of the budget, where we're increasing funding for higher ed. Corrections and local housing, this is a very significant number, obviously. $35.6 million for corrections to fund salary costs, supplies, and offender medical normally required every year in the supplemental bill. There'll be no surprise in the supplemental bill this year. There'll be a request for more money in the current year for corrections. It's happened every year as long as I can remember. What we've tried to do and are trying to do, and it's going to be an arduous process, is to try and right-size the correction budget so that we are funding them as they need to be funded and not having to constantly come back in a supplemental bill mid-year and pay for more than had originally been anticipated. That is primarily driven by the problem we've discussed many times in this body, and that is the inability to attract competent, qualified correction officers and to keep them in place once they're employed. It is the biggest revolving door in state government. It's low paid. It's a tough job, obviously, to work in a prison setting, particularly one like Angola, and people are getting hired and they're leaving as soon as they can get a little bit higher minimum wage from some private sector job. We've got to try and figure out ways to create incentives to maintain their employment. We did that a couple of years ago. You approved a slight raise in pay for correctional officers. In the short term, it helped. We saw some immediate response in hiring and keeping more people, prevented some people from retiring who were saying, I'm just going to go on and retire if I can't get paid more. But in the long term, it hasn't worked. The cycle has continued to repeat itself. And we're very fortunate that the state of Louisiana has avoided major problems in its prison system in recent years. We all must hope that that continues. But the biggest threat to that, I would suggest to you, is the inability to keep correction workers, to train them and to keep them, and to make certain that they're paid at a level that they're not going to suddenly leave and take some other job. That's the impetus behind recommending this significant amount of funding in the budget. Likewise, funding for local housing of adult inmates has gone up. It also is usually underfunded on the front end. That's included in where we are. All right, the Louisiana Department of Health. The executive budget, as you see in here, maximizes stat deads and means of financing swaps. Primarily what we've done here to be able to keep the Department of Health whole is rely upon this emergency federal FMAP that we've been talking about, this largesse that has come from the federal government and that has enabled us to take advantage of these enhanced rates through the end of calendar year 2021. You heard earlier in the discussion on the BA7, the money follows the patient model, which was approved by the legislature last year and timely submitted to CMS, has not yet been approved. Obviously, we're in a obvious transition period at the federal government. New people are coming in, and a lot of the questions that were asked by the previous administration, the new folks are asking some new questions. So we have not yet gotten approval of the money following the patient. Our hope is that that process gets approved. We think it's a much better system for Louisiana. You agreed after much discussion last session about the merits and demerits of changing what we were doing. And our hope is that at some point during the legislative process, we hope before the bill is finally passed, we'll know one way or the other from CMS that we're going to have this approved or it's not going to be approved. So the BA7 that you just approved dealt with the fact that we hadn't made that transition yet, and we had to move money from one pot in LDH to another. Wasn't any new money, wasn't any surprise money, just moving from one pocket to the other so that we could pay hospitals operating under the present system. If MFP, money following the patient, is ultimately approved by CMS, and we hope it is, then during the process we'll have to talk about how we have to move money into different buckets. It won't represent new money. We won't be asking for new state general fund dollars because it's actually going to enable us to save state general fund dollars in the long term, as was talked about in the details of this new model. So that's at a very high level, obviously, and I'll try and answer questions if you have questions about it when I'm done. But obviously, as you get into the budget discussions with LDH, you'll dwell in much more detail on that subject. The next slide shows you what we all know, and that is the amount of money that flows into the state from the federal government to fund the Medicaid program and our medical vendor program. Look at the state general fund numbers on the far left, and look at the federal dollars on the far right, and it shows the disparity in what we pay in general fund dollars compared to what we get from federal dollars. Obviously, those match rates are very significant, and they help drive that program. All right, now on an entirely different subject, and a concerning subject, the Conservation Fund. Louisiana's Conservation Fund is a constitutionally dedicated fund that has by and large driven the expenditures of the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries. We have never been in a position where we had to use state general fund dollars to prop up the wildlife and fisheries budget because the Conservation Fund took care of that. But the Conservation Fund, if you look at this chart, you can see the reduction, the steady reduction, that green line in Conservation Fund income over the years. This is not something that happened overnight. This is something that we've been aware of, you've been aware of, at least in discussions about it. But we've reached a point in this proposed budget year where the department simply is not going to be able to do what it's doing unless we inject some dollars into that fund. Now, the reason the fund goes down is mineral revenues are decreasing in the state. That's what drives the funding primarily for the Conservation Fund. It is going down, and as you know and you have heard previously, the department's fees are very low and haven't been raised in years. That's something you may or may not be discussing during this upcoming session. It was discussed previously, and there was no change in those fees, but with fees being stagnant and not keeping up with expenditures, with the Conservation Fund income going down dramatically and the needs at the very least holding where they are but probably being greater, convinced us that we have to inject some money this year into that department. We hope that there's some relief in sight. I'm not sure if there's going to be or not, but this could start a responsibility of the state to inject dollars into the department that had previously run solely on its Conservation Fund dollars. We've pressed the department over the past years that we've been here to reduce expenditures, to make some changes and do some things, and they've done it. They've eliminated 8 12-month vacancies. They've reduced requested vacancies. They've adjusted their attrition. They've done some things to try and save money, and we've been very careful and judicious in going through them to make sure that they're maximizing what they can do and still maintain services. But at some point, they're not going to be able to do the kind of enforcement things they're doing. They're not going to be able to provide the kind of programs that are provided in the fishery industry and the bird industry and all the other wildlife features that are an integral educational component of that department. So we make you aware of that. We're going to have to use the funds bill to deposit about $17 million into the Conservation Fund using excess revenue from the current year. Very quickly, as I kind of want to get through this, the Office of Technology Services, this is explanatory information on what they've done and the modernization projects that are underway. We've talked about during the past legislative sessions. We are in great need of modernizing so many systems in Louisiana, and we're knocking them out slowly but surely. You know that the LaGov implementation that we've talked about at great length in the past is completing in 21. The big agencies of government are the last ones to be converted. All the departments that have converted to LaGov are now on Louisiana checkbook, and their expenditures are available to be reviewed. And as we migrate more departments on to LaGov, they too will have the data on Louisiana checkbook. Broadband is an area that is important to all of us, and I want to start my discussion very briefly about broadband by introducing you to the gentleman that we have hired to basically coordinate our program. We have created, and you have been very supportive of, the Office of Broadband, what we're calling the Office of Broadband Development and Connectivity. It will be housed in the Division of Administration, physically adjacent to our OTS folks, because they'll be working very closely together, and they will be charged with the important mission of developing a cohesive, easily understood, visionary plan for broadband development in the state that will bring capabilities to every nook and cranny of Louisiana, particularly to our rural areas that do not have what they need right now, and to coordinate the effort of a lot of different pots of money that are being thrown at this issue. And so we need an individual person at the highest level in charge of that, and you've agreed, and we've been able to fund this not with state dollars, but with GEARS Act money, one of the CARES Act provisions that went to the governor and went to education, and some of the education funds that are earmarked in essence for broadband type usage are contributing to be able to pay for the operation of this office, which we intend to stand up for 3 years, and we hope during that time frame we're going to do what needs to be done to create this system and this prospect for Louisiana. The gentleman to run this department is standing right over here. His name is Vineeth Iyengar. I want to tell you a little bit about Vineeth, and some of you know him. He's an extremely accomplished gentleman, and we're very pleased to have him on board. He'll have 2 people that he will hire to assist him. He's a Baton Rouge native, a Baton Rouge Magnet High School graduate, spent a year in the Peace Corps, was a healthcare executive, was a congressional staffer, was chief executive officer of an overseas private management corporation. He has a BA in economics from Purdue and an MS in finance from Johns Hopkins University. He has been working for Mayor Broome in Baton Rouge as the assistant chief administrative officer in charge of economic development, and he has a background in this particular area that is going to serve him perfectly to be able to understand where all this money is coming from, how it can best be used, and what we can do to put it to work and put it to work quickly. So Vineeth, welcome aboard. You'll be working with these folks, and I know you'll be interested in hearing from him as he gets his feet wet. Okay, cyber, I'll just mention briefly, you've got data in your printout. Unfortunately, this has become a very active part of state government. Cybersecurity has now risen to a level in state governments and federal government that we wouldn't have imagined a decade ago. But we've seen the attacks in Louisiana, we've responded to the attacks, and you have funded appropriately funding for cybersecurity. We're recommending $10 million in the proposed budget for cybersecurity to continue doing the work that is ongoing, as well as to do even more to prevent attacks and to position us to be able to respond if and when those attacks occurred. Then the next sheet in much detail shows you every department. I'm not going to go through all these, but I want to give you the comparative numbers. The first column is what we call the EOB freeze, the executive budget that we present to you freeze date. Because we have to begin the budget process in November, we're obviously not very deep into the current fiscal year. The fiscal year begins in July. We start planning for the budget that same November. So we have to pick a date on which to start. And so we picked the latest possible date that we can use to know as much as we can know about where we are in the state's budget. And that has traditionally been December 1st, and it was again this year. So that's that first column where we started with that number. The executive budget shows you what the number is and shows you the ups and downs. I know that there's some red here that shows some reductions in state general fund. That does not mean that there are cuts in those departments. It means that we have used some of these alternative reasons for reducing the budget, or they simply were not continued in the proposed budget. For example, there was a host of amendments made by the legislature in the legislative process that we did not continue in the next year's budget. We did some, but not all of them. Those are decisions you make on a year-to-year basis, what goes in typically and what doesn't go in, and so we did not recur some of those. That makes up for some of these dollars in this chart. And I don't have it as part of your packet, but I'm going to send to all of you this afternoon an explanatory sheet that gives you the details of what makes up the plus and the minus of each of those departments. It's another one pager, but it just at least answers that question that I thought would be something people would be interested in. Finally, let me just reiterate some of the significant issues that we know are out there. The first is the Corps of Engineer payment that I mentioned, the obligation that the state has to pay for the post-Katrina work that was done. The state got a lot of money from the feds. We signed an agreement that obligated. It's a very one-sided agreement that is not favorable at all to the state, but it was what was done and had to be done at the time. But the bill is coming due. That's the bond issue that I talked to you about that we think can be paid in conjunction with what the congressional authorization gave us. Secondly, the Medicaid rule dealing with the changes to how we fund Medicaid. It'll be a big topic of discussion, and we'll get questions answered, we hope, from CMS during the course of the budget debate. I mentioned the Conservation Fund, and the last two are pretty obvious. The Unemployment Trust Fund is a major concern for all of us. That fund has been depleted. We're now borrowing money from the federal government to make our unemployment payments that fortunately are moving in the right direction. But that fund is going to have to be replaced sooner or later. I will tell you that my hope, I know the governor's hope, and I'm sure many of you's hope, is that the federal government will provide money to the states directly for the purpose of shoring up unemployment funds that have been dwindled, or that in any subsequent CARES Act that may pass, and as you all know, there's a lot of debate and discussion right now in Congress as to what happens. We think that there may be a resolution one way or the other in the not too distant future, and we'll know if there's going to be a new tranche of federal money and what it may be. If there is, we hope that the Unemployment Trust Fund will be specifically either included in that or authorized in that, because I would certainly tell you that we will be recommending a significant portion go to that Unemployment Trust Fund so that we don't have to raise taxes on businesses and so that we can shore up that fund that's been depleted. And finally, the big issue is it's sooner or later we're going to have to replace these federal dollars. They are here because Congress has recognized the condition that states are in. It's not just Louisiana, needless to say. It's virtually every state in the nation that's been challenged by this pandemic. We've had the benefit of dollars coming from the federal government that specifically allows us to help with our budget. And this emergency FMAP, as I've described to you, is really what's come to the rescue in the current year's budget. There's no reason to think that it's going to be extended beyond December of 21. We certainly hope that the pandemic is over or is minimized by that time, but it is now confirmed that we'll have it through the end of the year, but it's not going to last forever. So we're going to be in a position, the governor and the legislature, to answer the questions of what are we going to do about the budget when those dollars are not available anymore. If you look at where the economy was moving pre-pandemic, we have lots of reasons for optimism. The budget was over, state general fund budget was over $10 billion at that point, trending well, things happening in the right direction, growth, projects coming on board that gave us reason to think that that's going to continue. Then the bottom has fallen out. And so it is a question, how quickly will we return to pre-pandemic economic life, vitality in Louisiana? And how quickly is it going to happen, and to what extent is it going to happen? And we obviously are all going to be watching that very closely. We'll start getting glimmers of that at the upcoming REC meeting and future REC meetings this year. But it certainly is going to be on all of our minds what we do going forward, and we look forward to working with you on that challenge as well as on the issues presented in the budget. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you for your patience, and I'll try and answer questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Dardenne. First question from President Cortez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, first of all, Commissioner, thank you. I thought you did a really good job of kind of giving a really good overview of the last year, as difficult as it was for a lot of us. I think that the takeaway is the state general fund is moving in a good direction, even though we've been through a difficult 9 or 10 months. I think that you hit on this. The rainy day is moving in a good direction, even though we've had to utilize it. Surpluses have helped to fill it back up. The UAL, like you said, is moving in a good direction, and that's been a long, when I first got here, we weren't even paying the interest, so we weren't touching the principal. We now are not only paying the interest, but we're knocking down principal as we go, and I think that all of our children and grandchildren will benefit, because you won't have to hear, some of you who will be around for a while, you won't have to hear your superintendent say, I got to pay all of this UAL out of my MFP money. That'll go down, and it'll be a lot less. So those are certainly positive. Some of the unknowns I think you touched on, and I want everybody to understand that we don't know how good this economy will come back. It's still a wait and see. I believe it will, and I believe it's going to be good next year. But what is next? You know, you put what's next. What the federal dollars will look like and when will they show up, if at all, are questions that right now are unanswerable by us because the Congress hasn't made their decisions. But the biggest thing I think that you talked and you hit on it 3 times, but I want to make sure that everybody in this building understands that we have a debt for the levee system in southeast Louisiana that occurred on other people's watch. And look, everybody sat in their TVs and watched Katrina happen, and it basically was destroyed, the city and the parishes around there. And so when Commissioner Dardenne mentioned the $400 million initial payment by September 30th, and he said this, but I want to be clear, that's the first payment. Then we'll come back next year and have to make another $400 million payment. And then potentially come back the next year and make another payment of maybe just under 400 to the tune of $1.something billion, which is our share, the state's share of the Army Corps of Engineer project. Now, I want to be clear, the Commissioner did not mislead you, but he said some words that I want to make clear. He said the savings was it would have been $3 billion had our delegation, congressional delegation, not get language in the word of bill. That is all true. That's true. It would have been $3 billion. And for those of you who will be here in 6 years and 8 years and 10 years, you would still be having to deal with that problem. The point that I would like to make, though, is that we have $1 billion debt, and we're going to be attempting, and this is why we're here. We debate these things. We're a deliberative body, and everybody, 144 people, unless we lose a senator, then it'll be 143 to Congress. We will be debating whether it's good public policy to put into debt future generations to pay for this project. Now, we can debate all that, and Commissioner Dardenne and I have had a lot of good conversation about it. I don't know where I'm truly at. I don't think we have many options is where I think we're at. But people from all around the state are going to be paying the bonded indebtedness on that project. And was that project necessary? Unless we didn't want to have New Orleans and St. Bernard Parish and St. Charles maybe, and I don't know what else. Jefferson Parish might have been on the West Bank. So we are going to do that, but I don't think that you're going to face any more difficult decision, probably, with maybe fewer answers than this one issue that we have in front of us coming up. And it's not a one-year issue. It's a multiple-year issue. So if any of you can find $400 million in Memorial Hall between now and then, let's see if we can't put that. But I hate doing bonded indebtedness to pay for that portion of the share. I thank the congressional delegation, had a long conversation with Congressman Graves, who was with CPRA at the time, and said, we didn't have any options then, so we still don't. That being said, I look forward to the legislature debating this executive budget and starting it, and we're going to, I know Chairman Zarang and Chairman White, and I know that the Vice Chairman Cloud is going to talk up to this. We're going to drill down and do everything we can to work with the administration through the Committee on Finance and the Committee on Appropriations. As I always say, there's more wants than there are ever needs, and more wants than there are needs, and more needs than there are resources. And so we're going to do everything we can with the resources we have. I appreciate your comments today. I just didn't want people to leave here without understanding how big and how important that debt that we're going to be paying. That means one less project to Delhi, Louisiana. You understand that? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.
I think you'll work on that. Thank you, President Cortez. Commissioner Dardenne, I don't know, you have a comment on that, or you?
Well, And I recognize that, and Paige and I have talked about it, and it's something we need to talk about. It's a debatable issue, obviously, because it is a decision we're making on how to pay this. The only thing I would say is we're going to have to pay it one way or the other. It's going to be owed, and if we do it this way, it's going to be less than what we would otherwise owe if we don't pay it in one fell swoop. But the arguments can be made, and we look forward to trying to convince you that the way we're suggesting makes the most sense.
Commissioner, and President Cortez alluded to, there's no doubt we're going to debate this in both houses, but just a broad question as we move forward. You indicated on the executive budget, well, we had what was a $921 million hole, or not available in terms of funding, but now we have $1.12 billion. The question is, I understand the growth in general fund, recognizing by REC potentially, but the other funding sources, are those going to be used for recurring expenses? And I'm referring, I don't know what slide number it is, but it's basically the first step that you have for the executive budget. Slide 37, I think it is.
Yes, sir. The various details of the slide you're asking about, Mr. Chairman, the $113 million in the lottery proceeds MOS swap, essentially what that represents is, like the commissioner testified earlier, there's about the student count in the current year is being reduced based upon prior projections. So in essence, we're utilizing, instead of utilizing those resources in the current year, we're going to utilize those resources in 22. The next two numbers represent the federal emergency FMAP, the 6.2%. So I guess to answer your question specifically, and acknowledge sort of what the commissioner sort of closed the presentation out, we are acknowledging that we are going to have to come up with a plan to replace the use of the 6.2% FMAP provisions that he was speaking to earlier. But the 113 represents the fact that currently in the current year, the lottery proceeds fund those resources are being saved in the current year in order for us to use those in 22 to fully fund the MFP.
And I appreciate that. And we're going to drill down to it when we get in the committee. But again, the point being is we're assuming, or have to assume, a significant amount of growth. If we're going to build this into the budget and future budgets, we're assuming a significant amount of growth. I'm as optimistic as the next person, and I think we're going to move forward. But to replace this of this one-time money is a pretty substantial figure that moving forward, we need to recognize. And I just wanted to make that point.
Also, keep in mind for the committee's benefit, the revenue forecast that's adopted in place currently, the growth in the general fund from FY 22 to FY 23 is about $400 million. And to the extent that the economic conditions of the state do increase, we're hopeful and anticipating that those resources will increase to help us eventually offset the use of these resources in FY 22 for purposes of building FY 23.
And I'm with you. We're all hoping that, and hopefully that will happen. Representative Desatel has a question.
Thank you for that presentation. It was very, very informative. First, I want to say congratulations on your hire for the Office of Broadband. I think you've done a really good job. I think he's going to be an excellent addition and help move our state forward.
Thank you. We agree.
I do have a couple questions for you. In your presentation, you said the Office of Broadband Development and Connectivity. Is that the same office that we ran, the bill that I ran and the governor signed? Or is it different?
No, I think I don't think it has the same name that was created in the legislation. The legislation was dependent upon funding for that. We called it something different, but it's the same concept that you passed in that bill.
So that office is not the same office. I guess the question is, you mentioned that it was going to be housed in the Division of Administration, but the bill that I passed specifically says that it's going to be housed under the governor's office. So I'm just kind of make sure that we're talking about the same
technically
things.
The division is under the governor's office. I think it's kind of a distinction without a difference to that extent. But the concept of the bill that was passed is exactly what's put in place with this thing. We're not contemplating two different entities. We're contemplating this is the entity that is going to be charged with coordinating all of this. And it was also a matter of convenience and space of where we put people in close contact with the people he's going to be working with in OTS.
Right, and I think that was kind of the point of why the bill was drafted the way it was to make sure that there was some autonomy in that office and that that he could kind of act as his own. But I appreciate it. We can talk about this offline.
And
But thank you.
he will absolutely have the autonomy to do what needs to be done, but obviously he'll answer directly to me. He's going to report directly to me, so it's a very high-level position that he's going to be undertaking.
Well, I appreciate it, and I'd like to maybe schedule some time with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Representative Desautels. Representative Harris, he waves. Senator Hewitt for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This is maybe more of a statement than a question, but I wanted to comment again on the hurricane and storm damage risk reduction system payment. You know, one of the points that I've made several times in this committee, as have others, is that, you know, we needed to be including that in our 5-year fiscal statement. That section 5 that talks about horizon issues not contained in the 5-year plan is intended to capture those future liabilities so that they're on our radar and we can plan for them. And although there's words to that effect, there's not that $3 billion or $1 billion number listed in here, which I had always been asking for, because I do think that, you know, again, we didn't know exactly what the number was going to be, but we knew we were going to have to pay something and it was going to be significant. And I think that if this had been on our radar more, that we would have probably done a better job of maybe thinking about, in years when we had a surplus, maybe we would be putting some money away because we knew we were going to have to pay this bill at one point in time. And so I kind of just want to make a point, and for the process going forward, these large, big liabilities, we need to be having them on their radar, which was the intent of this, and to be planning for it in our thinking in years when we have a surplus.
Yes, ma'am, I understand. It was been on the fiscal status statement for the past 2 years. It was not a part of the 5-year projection because we didn't know what the number was going to be. It was very uncertain what we were going to have to ultimately pay because we were in the process of negotiating, trying to get a reduction, trying to get credit for other projects that we paid for that have enhanced the system. So that's why it wasn't on that 5-year deal, but it's clearly been discussed publicly and been on that fiscal statement for the last 2 years.
In just hand waving, respectfully, kind of hand waving terms, I think it should have been at least described in terms of a range with the maximum or the best case, worst case, or something. I mean, we're talking $1 to $3 billion. These are not small dollars. And I think that, again, we've been sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit blindly. Maybe it has been discussed. It usually doesn't get discussed at every monthly joint budget meeting. I mean, we kind of roll through that part pretty quickly. And there's not, I mean, you look at today's sheet, there's not a number on this page other than just the words describing what the issue is and hoping that we would get it resolved. You know, that's section 5. It's not there. And so I'm just making a point for the future that I would like for us to do a better job of capturing those future liabilities in a little bit more transparent way.
And I can assure you that will be done because we'll know one way or the other. We're either going to have a fixed debt to pay the bonding obligation if that's what is approved, or we'll be starting to have to pay the much larger number that'll take us longer time, 30 years to pay off and end up costing the state and the state taxpayers huge more dollars. But so we will absolutely know going forward because we're going to have an answer. We've never had that answer, but I understand your point.
And for any other future obligations that are of this kind of a magnitude, I think, again, that's the place where my thought was we were capturing them so we know when we've got some big future obligation hanging over our head.
Yeah, thank goodness there's nothing else like this looming.
Always till next year.
Yeah, that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Hewitt. There are no other questions. Here's your opportunity. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioner.